the banking system, and the real reason is that we think that we're dependent on this banking system for our credit, but we're not. Like Dorothy and all the characters in The Wizard of Oz, we have the power to create our own money and our own credit. The government's mentality in general seems to be, we'll do what we have to do and we'll worry about paying for it later. But what you could do is pay for it now. In other words, you don't have to pay for it later. You don't have to pay for it with debt. You can just pay for it with money.
In the Money Masters solution, the government creates all the money in the form of debt-free U.S. notes or their electronic equivalents, and then spends that money into existence through the normal budgetary process. Existing money is, of course, replaced one for one with the new debt-free money. The national debt is paid off with this new money as well, but to prevent inflation, reserve requirements are gradually raised on the commercial banks, requiring them to maintain 100% reserves. In other words, banks could then only loan out money they actually have.
I think that the solution is what I call $1 of capital, which is simply that you have to have $1 of capital against every unsecured asset you lend against. So if you're going to loan against a credit card, you have to have $1 of capital for every dollar that's outstanding in balance. If you're going to write loans against houses or against cars, you can write all the loans you want against the value of that asset, whatever that is. And as long as you do that, there's never a banking safety and soundness issue.
Solutions at the state level will be easier to achieve initially before reform at the federal level is politically possible. An interesting fact is you don't have to have a federal charter to create a bank. States can charter banks as well. All it takes is a bill passed by the state legislature. Many states already allow state-chartered banks. The state then deposits all their funds into their new bank and can then utilize the fractional reserve principle to their advantage by making loans to themselves for roads, bridges, etc. at no interest. When the loans are repaid, the money is extinguished from the system. The beauty of this system is you create wealth without creating a permanent increase in the money supply and the consequent inflation.
During the Civil War, Virginia authorized counties to issue their own debt-free money. Since there was no gold, there would have been no money in circulation to maintain commerce. These surviving bills are tissue paper thin.
Minnesota monetary reform expert Byron Dale has proposed legislation for Minnesota to charter a state bank which would be empowered to give the state government all the money necessary to provide infrastructure funding such as road building and repair without debt or interest.
My concept of money reform is just a little bit different, but it's only based upon the fact that for me personally, it's easier to work on my state legislators than it is my federal legislators. And of course, the solution to our problem is clearly money put into circulation without debt. Now, it really doesn't make any difference how you do it. It's just as long as the money comes into circulation without a debt to anybody and as a payment. The very concept of the bill is to simply have the banks create the money and spend it into circulation to build the infrastructure for the state.
This proposal is currently working its way through the Minnesota legislature with several bankers as sponsors. Actually, the state-owned bank idea is nothing new. The Bank of North Dakota is the only state-owned bank in America. It was created in 1919 as a populist movement swept through the debt-ridden farmers of the Northern Plains. Even in these worst of times, the Bank of North Dakota is earning record profits and helping fund their state. It's been doing this for the last 90 years, hardly a radical startup idea. According to the bank's president, Eric Hardmeyer,
we are the depository for all state tax collections and fees. We plow those deposits back into the state in the form of low-interest loans. Over the last 10 to 12 years, we've turned back $1/3 of $1 billion just to general fund, to offset taxes or to aid in funding public sector needs. Not bad for a state with a population of 600,000. In 2009, the state of North Dakota does not have any funding issues at all. We, in fact, are dealing with the largest surplus we've ever had.
Interestingly, the Bank of North Dakota idea was initiated by a group of Swedish immigrants to North Dakota in the early 1900s. Community banking had been going on in Sweden for at least a century before that. Around 1820, the Swedes came up with the idea of the savings bank. These full reserve banks only lent out money they actually had. They decentralized the money power and were encouraged by the government as a way for municipalities to fight poverty. These operated on what was known as the church steeple principle, where the bank could only make loans to customers whose houses could be seen from the highest church steeple in town. These community banks increased the commonwealth instead of the big bankers' wealth. This helped Sweden grow rich, which helped Stockholm to grow into the magnificent Venice of Scandinavia that we see here today. But then the debt-based bankers attacked the savings banks. They first convinced most of them to consolidate into bigger and bigger banks. Then the Swedish Parliament was convinced to pass a law allowing the non-profit savings banks to be bought up by the commercial banks. After a series of mergers, these banks are now called Swedbank.
They were under severe attack during the 80s, but many of the saving banks still remain in the country. And they are very effective, and especially because they decentralize the power and give it back into the hands of the citizens. They empower the local communities. And in times of crisis, they have proven to be more profitable than the big banks.
Now there are only about 50 savings banks left, a small remnant of a great idea for publicly owned banking that shows that communities or even nations can operate debt-free. Iceland's tiny economy and sparse resources were also nurtured by a series of public interest savings banks. Despite a population of a little over 300,000 people and a gross domestic product of around only $12 billion, Iceland is one of the most civilized nations on earth. But then the government privatized the savings banks, similar to the Swedish savings banks 20 years earlier. But in Iceland's case, even the Landsbanken, which essentially was the Bank of Iceland, was privatized as well. For the first few years, things looked good. The economy doubled. But under the surface, the private bankers were creating a huge financial bubble. They opened a new offshore internet bank called Icesave, targeting depositors in the UK and Holland by offering attractive interest rates for new depositors. Hundreds of thousands of new accounts were opened. Entire towns and police department pension funds put their money into Icesave, as did charities such as cancer relief funds. Using fractional reserve lending, Icesave fanned that into billions for questionable new loans. Icesave started investing in European ventures, especially in Russia. Many now believe that Icesave actually became a money laundering operation for the Russian mafia. All the while trading on the good reputation for solid banking Iceland had built up over the previous decades.
However, when bank was privatized, it still used the good reputation of Iceland to grow huge and do, lots of criminal activities. And the owner, Björgólfur Thor, he became one of the rich boys in the world really quickly, one of the billionaires. I've seen documents linking him to the Russian mafia and his father. One oligarch that fled to the UK confirmed that Iceland was used as a money laundering machine for the Russian mafia.
When the crash came in 2008, the big Icelandic banks quickly failed.
In the 5 years' time they were privatized before the collapse, they actually grew 10 times the Icelandic GDP. And when it collapsed, you can imagine how huge the collapse was, because they collapsed onto the shoulders of the nation or the taxpayers.
The Icelandic parliament at first poured enormous amounts of taxpayer money into them to try to save them, but they still failed. Then the government bailed out all the Icelandic depositors, but the IceSave accounts were not in Iceland and were never insured by the Icelandic government, and so they were not bailed out. However, in the face of tremendous political pressure at home, the British and Dutch governments bailed out the IceSave accounts of their citizens, and then tried to make Iceland pay for it at terms that have decimated Iceland's fragile economy.
The income tax of more than half of the nation, just the interest of this particular loan. Then you have other loans. Then we would have gotten from, in 2007, being the most developed nation in the world, into a nation spending all its GDP just paying interest of foreign loans.
Inflation shot up. Icelanders soon discovered that even the principal on their home mortgage loans was indexed to inflation. Many Icelanders saw the principal on their home mortgages double and their payments triple. This despite rising unemployment.
The way the loan system is in Iceland is completely outrageous. I mean, it is, your rights as a consumer are zero.
Foreclosures mounted and the citizens rioted. They call it their revolution. They stormed the Parliament Square. The president was forced to call for a referendum. 93% of the people voted not to bail out the bankers.
The Brits aren't exactly a shining light here about how to handle international relations.
No, it's one of the worst conducted, most absurd things I've seen in a long time, really. I mean, it is obvious that the Icelandics cannot afford to pay this money back. What we've just seen is the first anti-bailout tax vote here.
Now the ruling party is trying to convince Iceland to join the European Union to be eligible for loans to save its economy. The people, however, seem unconvinced that more and more debt is the solution. Iceland now seems determined to take back their money power and not take on more national debt.
What I want to implement here is a healthy banking system where you don't have fractional reserve, you don't have high interest, the bank should not serve as mafia outlets. It should be something that is important for the communities.
Over 70% of Iceland now opposes joining the EU, and some are now supporting proposals for cities to start up savings banks based on the Bank of North Dakota model to provide local credit and stop the rising wave of housing foreclosures.
We're not part of EU yet. They are trying to put us in it with 70% of Icelanders don't want to join the EU, but the Social Democrats are in power, and that is their sole mission, to get Iceland into the EU.
Iceland is proud of its democratic heritage. Iceland is the home of the oldest parliament in Europe, having met annually for over 1,000 years. For the first 800 years, the Icelandic parliament met at this site, where the North American tectonic plate meets the European plate. Called Thingvellir, Icelanders consider this a holy site where elected government was born. Today, Iceland is the new battleground as it attempts to become the first nation in modern times to escape the serfdom of the debt money system. If Iceland escapes, the rest of the world will be watching.
If you end up paying this money, entering into the EU to try to find salvation that way, it will only get worse. The thing, what has happened in Iceland is going to happen on a worldwide scale in our lifetime. There won't be enough money to cover all the debt.
Why are governments pumping money into private banks? Why are they not letting them roll? I mean, just like any other. And then the excuse is, oh, they're too big to fail. Let them fail, please.
So what this all boils down to is whether America, still the freest nation in history, will once again break free of the privately owned central bank as it has 6 times in the past. Our money is not issued by the government, even though they make it look like it is. It doesn't have to be this way. This system has got to go. Some will say, well, those crooks in Congress will create too much money once they get the money power.